Computing became automated around 1944 during World War II, and it emerged at first as an information processing device because it was for computing, it was for making calculations. Later, it became an information processing device. And then, so those five, I wrote a book called The Fifth Language. And luckily the book sold out, and the publisher said, we're going to print a second printing of your book. And I said, no, don't do that. I want to add the internet as the sixth language. Why did the internet emerge? Well, people were computing, they were creating files, they didn't know what to do with all this information. They had to send it out. And the internet emerged, which is really a marriage of the computer and the telephone. Now, why do I call these 6 different languages? Because each has its own semantics and its own syntax. You might think speech and writing are the same thing. Well, they're not. You don't use the same words when you write as when you speak. You don't use the same grammatical constructions when you write as when you speak. If you make a transcription of what I speak to you today, you will see that I make many grammatical mistakes. But you understand what I say. Why? Because I'm here. I have a personality. I use my hands. I have facial gestures. I moderate my voice. Sometimes I use a higher pitch, a lower pitch. All this provides information. When you write, you can't see the writer, and therefore it has to be very precise and very grammatical. So each new language emerged to deal with the chaos of the information that the previous language could not hold. And I think I've already told you what's in the next paragraph, which you can read as well as I can. The interesting idea here is the idea of emergence. What we've learned in the last maybe 30, 40 years is that when you have complex situations in which chaos exists, like when you have an information overload, what often happens is a new level of order emerges. And each of the new languages that emerged were part of this kind of phenomenon. Emergence, by the way, is the way life came to be. There were complex biomolecules that were floating around in a soup, and they self-organized into a system that could replicate itself, and that was the beginning of life. As a joke, I wrote a paper called, Is Google the Seventh Language? That was a joke, but you didn't laugh. Good. All right, now comes the extended mind. So I wrote this book, The Fifth Language, The Sixth Language. Everything starts with spoken language. And then I asked the question, where does language come from? And again, it emerges out of the complexity of human life. Actually, the complexity of hominid life. Before there were humans, as you know, there was Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo neanderthalis. These are called the hominids. They were not quite human, and they did not have spoken language as we do. However, they made tools, they controlled fire, they began to live in larger groups. At first, they only lived with the nuclear family, mama, papa, and the children. Then with fire, they had to keep the fire going. And so many families got together and they formed a clan, and they lived around the fire. And then, of course, they had to develop something called social intelligence, because as you all know, life in the family is very complex. You have to have a certain kind of intelligence to be able to negotiate and to navigate through your family's, this aunt wants this one, this uncle wants that one, mama wants you to do this, etc. So social intelligence developed. Also, the people began to have coordinated hunting and gathering. They began to share their food. And they developed a very primitive form of communication. It's a form of communication that's still with us. It's called mimetic communication. As I talk to you, you notice I use my hands. I use my facial gestures. I use my body. Although I'm sitting, I could really, go really crazy and use my entire body to communicate to you, but then they wouldn't hear me. And then I use nonverbal vocalization. If I were to talk in a monotone like this, you would soon fall asleep, because then I would sound like a robot. And nobody wants to talk to a robot. Have you ever been out with somebody that talks like a robot? Only once, then you don't want to see them again. So these four forms, hand signals, facial gesture, body language, and nonverbal vocalization, are mimetic communication. And they were able to communicate one's intentions. But one could not talk about abstract things. One could not plan. In order to plan, you have to have concepts. So what were our first concepts? Well, our first concepts were our first words. I've already told you what's on this slide. Now, at the bottom of the slide is an important idea, and that is that as the complexity increased, our percept-based brain, that is, the brain that we had, which is only based on percepts, the things that we sense, couldn't cope with all the complexity. There was a need for concepts, for abstract thought. And speech represents a bifurcation, that is, a fork in the road, from percepts to concepts. Doesn't mean that you stop having percepts. Of course, you still have your perceptions, you perceive things, you have feelings, you have emotions, but now you also have language and you're able to conceptualize. And our first words were our first concepts. They acted as strange attractors for all the percepts associated with those words. So let me give an example. Let's talk about the word water. The word water unites our percepts of the water that we drink, the water we cook with, the water we wash with, rain, melted snow, lakes, rivers. And so once we have this concept, we're able to plan, and we're able to achieve a higher level of existence, and that's when we become human. Now, some linguists will tell you that speech is the communication of your internal thoughts, that somehow you have a language of thinking inside of your brain, and then you translate that into spoken language. But I believe that thought is as much silent speech as speech is vocalized thought. So without these words, you wouldn't be thinking very much. Sadly, there are some children that have been isolated from society, like wild children, and they never were able to learn language, and the level of their intellectual life was extremely low because they didn't have language. Merlin Donald, whose ideas I stole and transformed, remixed, the same way that people now remix music. I remix other people's ideas. And a great scholar is somebody that steals other people's ideas, and a great scholar steals everybody's ideas and remixes them and gives a new idea. There's nothing new under the sun, but there are new combinations. So Merlin Donald claimed that mimetic communication was a cognitive lab in which verbal language developed. And it was intentional, it was representational. And I asked the question, if it was such a good system of communication, why did we need verbal language? And the reason we needed verbal language is because we need it for conceptualization, we need it for symbolic and abstract thought, and we needed it for planning. It allows us to think about things that are not present. We can talk about something that isn't here in the room. So I can tell you about Canada, my wonderful country that I come from. And I can tell you we have lots of snow, and it might be cool here in Vic today, but this is nothing for a Canadian. So I can discuss something which is not here in the room. I can talk about something, Carlos told you about what's going to happen later today, something that's not here at this time. Without language, we couldn't have this kind of conversation.